Hi, I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and this is Sound Strategic, our podcast showcasing the talents of the exceptional analysts that make up the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I am delighted to have with me today Henry Boyd, who runs part of our defense and military analysis team, contributes to the Military Balance and the Military Balance Plus database. He was educated at two of the very best schools here in this cosmopolitan city. The first, he did his undergraduate work in war studies at King's College and his graduate work at the London School of Economics. Henry, thanks for coming to talk today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Kori. Thank you for having me on. I like the fact you think I went there because they're good schools and not because they are all within a 1 kilometre radius of my current place of employment. I just got lazy. I kept getting off at the same tube stop every day.
Yeah, you couldn't be bothered to be creative about where you were going to school, so you just went nearby where you were.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Done me well so far.
So what the defense and military analysis team is brilliant at is metrics, and we've just determined Henry's school selection metric, which is proximity to workplace.
There's a graph on that somewhere, in probably pretty colours.
So, as our regular listeners know, we have a standard set of questions that we put all of the analysts to so that we have some continuity to the listening experience. And the first one is, what in your work, Henry, ties into things people are reading about in the newspapers and worrying about in strategic studies right now?
In my time at the Institute, I've worked on a lot of different things, but right now I've been doing most work in the last couple of years on military capabilities for the United States, China, and Russia. And you may have noticed that a great power rivalry is back, baby. For better or, well, maybe for worse. And with that comes the possibility of military competition or even conflict between the great powers. So I'd say that's a pretty interesting time to be working on that kind of subject, and particularly for a product called the Military Balance. You think?
So I want to post a link to the brilliant Chinese military wall chart that you made for the 2019 Military Balance, because it's absolutely spiffy. And I hadn't seen anything like it, so we'll post a link to that. My question, though, is why does Russia qualify as part of great power competition? What's the metric that gets us to Russia being in that weight class?
It's an interesting combination of capability and its actual intent or use of power across the spectrum, not just military, but in other senses. In some senses, what you do is to some extent as important as what you have. Russia is still the largest, by quantity, the largest nuclear power in the world, and still retains a very sizable military force, even if in comparison to both the US and Russia, it is in numerical and investment terms lower down the pecking order. But Russia's actions in the last few years have demonstrated its ability to achieve political ends with its military capability that in some ways reflects is comparable, if not better, than some of its peers, such as the US and China, who have struggled to achieve long-standing political ends with their military activity.
I think Syria is a perfect illustration of that, right? At the time, the Obama administration was saying there's no military solution to this problem. Russia actually proved there's a military solution to this problem. They prevented Assad from losing power. They roped the Iranian ground game in with a Russian air game, and they became the determiner of the outcome in Syria.
I think one of the things that sometimes gets overlooked is there's a difference between there is no military solution to the problem and there is no military solution to the problem that is acceptable within the bounds of what we want to happen and what we're prepared to break in order to do so. I don't think there are good grounds for not undertaking military actions such as the one Russia undertook in Syria, but at the same time, you can achieve results with the right combination of complete disregard for human rights and or long-term stability in places like Syria.
I think that's exactly right. So the Russian tactic of following up Syrian government chemical weapons strikes by bombing the hospitals that the casualties were being taken to try and increase the deniability of chemical weapons use is an utterly brutal, incredibly effective tactic the Russians undertook that made them a major power broker in the Middle East, and that's something that those of us in free societies would be unwilling to do. And so they accrued enormous political power as a result of not so much their capability, but their willingness. So let's talk about China and the US and great power competition. How do you stack those two up?
It's an interesting combo of location and time frame. It depends on where you military activity and military competition doesn't take place in a vacuum. You don't line up everything you have all at once on a neutral playing field, equidistant away from your home base. It takes place in specific places for specific reasons. And if you do an overall measurement of things, you conduct an inventory of the military forces of Russia, of United States and China, beg your pardon, you will still see a US that is superior in many different categories of military capability. However, that's not to say that within the specific bounds of a current conflict in the Asia-Pacific region, that the US would be able to bring all of that capability to bear. It's much further away from China. It has other responsibilities globally it needs to attend to at the same time. So how you figure out what an appropriate level of relative balance between various capabilities. One of the, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, one of the things we occasionally mistake in assessing military capabilities is you don't always have to be the best. You have to be good enough at a certain point in time, at a certain place in time to achieve what you want to achieve.
So you're telling me that assessing military capabilities ought to be graded like Olympic diving? We want a degree of difficulty factored into the score? Because what the Chinese are trying to do is prey on the autonomy of their regional neighbors and fight close to their shore to break American alliances, to push us back out of the Asia-Pacific region, whereas what the United States is trying to do is fight how many miles away from America's territorial holdings to do something incredibly difficult in concert with other countries who get a political veto over how we do it.
I'd say, and in addition to that, trying to do so within some ethical and legal constraints that some other countries aren't necessarily. There's a balancing level between how far you want to go, but I think it's certainly every country faces its own individual military requirements, and it has its own political objectives and its own relationship between where on that spectrum the military force will be employed to achieve them. I think the US has historically always undertaken fairly ambitious, in fact, incredibly ambitious goals for its political ends. So its military force is designed to do a whole lot of things that on paper is a very hard task to achieve, simultaneously achieving overmatch in the Asia-Pacific against a rising China whilst reassuring its European allies against Russia, whilst maintaining an overwatch position in the Middle East and overseeing global shipping. This is the kind of activity that is only achievable at low cost under the most benign of circumstances. And I think one of the long-term problems that the US now faces is where it puts its priorities here. Can it continue to do things? We've seen historically great powers who have maintained that kind of global presence have been able to do so for a while, and then have faced over the long term challenges to decline of their position, and they have to manage that. Managing that decline is something that doesn't necessarily sit well with established American political norms, and it's something that'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
I regret to inform you, Henry Boyd, that you have stumbled onto a subject I actually know something about, which is what makes for peaceful transitions between an established hegemonic power and a rising challenger. And so I want to quiz you on a couple of things about this. One is that it's certainly true that historically the trend you describe is the dominant theme. But one of the things that's different about the time of American dominance in the international order is that we didn't recreate previous orders. We created an order where power has greater legitimacy because weaker states get a say over outcomes, and creating rules that more or less bind us all voluntarily and that more or less get grounded in institutions has created the anomalous historical incidents whereby the strongest powers in the order are actually allied to the United States, not in opposition to it. And the loudest hand-wringing over the end of the liberal international order is actually from America's allies, and they're actually desperate that the United States itself is collapsing it. So where does China fit in this constellation? Can it accrue the military power to attain the political aims that it appears to be seeking if Western powers play team sports?
That is going to be an interesting calculation. I think the time frame China is looking at, if you take them at face value, they have 2020, 2035, and 2049 end goals for various aspects of their military modernization. And those are then tied to levels of expected capability and levels of, presumably, although not explicitly stated, the levels of military capability their potential opponents are expected to have in those periods of time. One would assume they've done the maths on that, and they have their own internal views about how those calculations end up. My suspicion is those calculations are not based upon a united and determined military resistance from both the United States and key regional and extra-regional partners. I think their view probably is that historically that there are, whilst the Western Alliance has hung together pretty well for the Cold War, it has not always hung together with one voice and in one broad, full-throated chorus. Debates about minimum NATO spending, amongst others, and basing capability.
Extended nuclear deterrence, or whether we'd go to war over Berlin.
All those things have come true at one point or another. If you look at the base maths, there is a kind of China as an individual unit actor. Its economic base it can mobilize in support of its defense spending is pretty substantive. And a China versus US comparison, you can see broad trend lines where China's overall economic capabilities and thereby its defense spending can catch up and overtake the Americans, and thereby over a long period of time clearing up the kind of investment in capability the America has a lead on them, that China might be able to overtake that. So there's a question for bandwagoning versus resistance, and obviously there's a point at which if too much resistance is created by a rising Chinese military capability that is too outwardly obvious or too outwardly worrying, generates a threat balance amongst other regional states, then you can create the seeds of your own problem where simply you're not going to be able to do enough yourself to overcome that.
So the reason Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II had a Europe-first strategy, even though the Asia-Pacific War was what brought the United States into the conflict, was that he made a judgment that if either Britain or the Soviet Union capitulated to Nazi Germany, there was no other constellation of powers the United States could gather together in order to constrain Nazi Germany. And I think about that when I think about the balance of power in Asia all the time, because if the Chinese are such brilliant strategists, why are they reinforcing America's alliance relations at a time we are recklessly endangering them? It just doesn't fit with this notion of these fabulous mandarins who have 100-year time frame, and we plodding liberals can't manage to put one shoe in front of the other. Do you have a view on this before we go on to other questions?
I think there's always a danger in overestimating sort of opaque levels of you would jump to worst case scenarios. This is true in international politics, but defence as well. And that level of if we don't know where on a spectrum in terms of capability someone is in terms of how brilliant a strategist are they. We don't have very much evidence to judge by. We tend to kind of worst case scenario can play out, and we suddenly go, well, they must be great because we don't know very much about anything. We don't know much about their failures. We look at what they're doing and we go, like, this is a challenge for us. They must be geniuses, and
I think that's exactly right. So, how did you get interested in this line of work, Henry Boyd?
I'm a child of the 1980s. So the 1980s, the last kind of gasp of serious Cold War fear, and the introduction of very shiny military equipment on both East and West. You see the great American collection of last offset military equipment. So F-15, F-16, M1, all of this stuff is in service, and big pictures and big toys available of these things during the 1980s, 1990s. So I'm sure that influenced me somewhere along the line. I think I dabbled in wargaming as a kid, not very large old, but yeah, I was. I'm not sure how much participatory it was, but certainly in the works on the books, the magazines, the collections, and stuff like that. And I became I was interested in military history somewhere along the line there, probably in the teenage years. So I think some people in my family regret having bought something quite small that set me off on this wild historical course. But that was the school years.
Oh, that's excellent. So you knew this was where you were headed.
I knew I wanted to. I knew I was interested in the subject matter. I didn't believe this was a career you could have. I believe.
You mean they pay me to do
I'm
doing now?
I may have been somewhat surprised to discover there were professional jobs outside the military that did this kind of thing. I'm still somewhat surprised by this, but I think there's always a little level of fascination into why humans continue to act in warlike fashion. War continues to be a human activity that is regularly practiced, but always gets a bad write-up. People are very quick to tell you how bad this thing is, and they're right in many ways, and yet we keep doing it. And I'm absolutely fascinated about what about human beings makes that the case. That high-fluting philosophy concept manifests in spending a lot of time working on orders of battle, the British Army and European armies during the 18th and 19th century, and then going and looking at medieval history on various other things and discovering how little we actually know about detail in these periods. It's always deeply disturbing to a historian. It's like, it can't possibly be true, we just don't know what happened. God bless medieval history.
Favorite book in your field?
I think that this is a. What is your favourite? What's your favourite book in your field, and why is it Safe Passage by Kori Schake, available in all good bookstores and very reasonably priced?
Nobody has given that answer. Literally nobody. Nor do I imagine anybody ever will.
There is a Grover Cleveland fan club out there. Exciting power transition work for us. Asking academics about their favourite book is akin to asking parents about which of their children is their favourite.
Okay, my parents have a very clear lexicon of who their favorite children are. So come on, give me the books.
Look, all right. One of my friends used to get asked the question at King's, which war is your favourite? And his only answer was, I love them all equally. I am not going to pick a favourite book. I'm going to pick the last one I read that I really enjoyed on the subject, which is actually a book on wargaming. It's Simulating War by Philip Sabin, who is Professor of Strategic Studies at King's, my old alma mater. I think wargaming still gets, to some extent, a bad or slightly dismissive rap in the wider kind of public consciousness. It's associated with kind of recreational unseriousness. It's elves and dragons and sort of. It's not a serious.
Civil War
reenactors. It's something that people do in their day off, but not a serious tool for helping us in an academic way understand sort of real world problems. And I think one of these is actually it is a really useful tool in putting the human, especially if you're conducting a manual war game in person, putting the human element back into a kind of quintessentially human activity. It's how you get human input into testing and simulating sort of your hypotheses on theories like, well, do we have enough military assets in this region for this scenario? Is there a better way of working out whether that's actually true than getting people to run through in practice? And you can't do that. You can't put all the heavy metal out there every day and run that 150 times, but you can get 150 different people to run a devised scenario. I think Philip does a really good job at explaining both the utility of doing that kind of wargaming, but also the utility of having people being asked to design their own gaming and come up with and think about how you factor in, how you recreate the various uncertainties that surround war as an activity. And we talk about You could talk about the quintessential Clausewitzian description of war, comparing it to a game or a game of cards, and I think that wargaming deserves, and it's now being taken more seriously within the military and within defence establishments, I think deserves a better, wider appreciation of its value and its place within strategic studies generally.
That's an excellent answer, and I will go read the book so that I can perhaps someday gain admittance into DMAP's wargaming of issues like what does European defense autonomy look like, and what would it look like if you didn't have Britain in the European Union, which is a terrific piece of work the Defense and Military Analysis team has done, and I encourage everybody to go see it. Okay, Henry, what's the conventional wisdom in your field that's wrong?
Oh, it's a while. How long we got this? A couple of hours? 3 hours maybe? I don't know where we stand with this. Oh, I'm tempted to go with the idea that you have to put everything in acronyms and long conceptual words for it to mean anything, but I think we'll leave that to others. I mentioned the shiny military equipment in the 1980s, and I'm going to be very careful how I say this because part of the military balance is a very long list of military inventories. Don't get me wrong, equipment has an important role to play in military capability, but if you judge by the volume of output that is produced upon military equipment and comparative military equipment studies versus other aspects of military capability, such as doctrine, organisation, training, and personnel, perhaps, I think we're overly weighted towards equipment in our analysis, and we can get very easily distracted by military equipment metrics and compare it the endless internet discussions about which main battle tank is better. I mean, again, I mentioned at the start that military activity takes place for a reason in a specific place in a specific time, and which piece of equipment, which piece of doctrine is better depends upon how that plays out. And overly emphasizing one particular aspect of capability can eventually be unhelpful at actually understanding what capability is and what it means, and thereby how useful it is in any certain circumstance.
I've always liked Jeffrey Blaney's description of the cause of war being so simple, and he, in his book on the causes of war, he bats away all the sophisticated explanations and concludes that countries fight wars because they think they can win. And too much focus on the shiny military equipment very often creates false positives. A belief that we have the best equipment, therefore we have the best army. Again, any remedial study of history would show you that's not true. Any remedial study of American and Allied wars of the last 17 years would also show that's not true. So you don't even have to study history, you just have to study current events to know that that's not true. But I think you're right, there's a bias towards equipment as the proper metric, and doctrine matters, grit matters. Right? Buford at Gettysburg kind of grit makes a huge difference. And it looks to me, tacking back to great power competition, that the Chinese are fearful that they may begin to have the equipment, they may begin to have the spending, but they don't have the combat experience, and they probably don't have the training and wargaming to make them confident that they can do what they say they can do.
I think there's no doubt the Chinese view gaps in their overall level of military capability. They have set themselves a long time frame to fix those. They are aware of what they are. Whether self-knowledge is it's the first step towards overcoming a problem, but whether it's sufficient is not true. Their ability to close those gaps is another subject of interesting debate. I think it's interesting. It's nice to see that debate is being taken up now, and that there's a lot of stuff, a lot of discussion, and rightfully so, on various new Chinese equipment projects. But I think perhaps more important for determining the level and where and when China will pose a military challenge to both the United States and to its Western allies is really determined by where China feels confident enough in those less tangible aspects of military capability, and where their internal reckoning on where they stack up vis-a-vis other powers are. What's the time frame? How long? How much? When is good enough?
Again, back to Blaney, right? When do they think they can win?
say there's probably one or two aspects in history where people have gone to war expecting to lose, but it's rare. Most people go to war because there is a reason, a chance somewhere along the line that if you roll the dice like this, things will work out in your favor.
Ernie May's magnificent book, Strange Victory, about the German invasion of France in 1940 and why French resolve collapses. His recounting of the interior German conversations, astonished at their success. And we think about that as so predetermined an outcome, and they didn't think about it as predetermined. They were much more risk tolerant and thought they were likely to lose, but it was worth doing anyway, which is a whole different frame of reference. Okay, best work you think you've ever done. Or let me put it differently. The work you've done that you like best.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So there was this school college I did when I was 5 out of back. No, wait. We've mentioned the China chart already. I mean, I hate to say it because I am a perfectionist about things like that. I am really happy with it. I like how that turned out. That's something I think is...
It's incredibly detailed and informative.
Both a high-quality piece of work, but a useful piece of work given the timing. I don't think we've got enough information in the public space about the size and scope and deployment of China's armed forces within China. We know much more about Russia publicly. There's enough information. There's a lot of information out there now. China is talked about in broad terms, but there's not enough English language detailed work on China to begin to make assessments about its actual size and direction of its armed forces. The piece of work I'm sneakily proudest of, even though I really shouldn't be proud of, is... I remember this the other day, I was thinking about something else entirely. There is one Wikipedia article that cites me by name and quotes me. It's the illustrious Syrian 18th Armoured Division. I have no idea why I get a name check and a quote rather than just a citation list, but I do. And I treasure that piece, even though the blog itself, not my finest piece of work, I have to say. It was
Henry Boyd of the IISS noted that, quote, in Homs, the 18th Armored Division was reinforced by Special Forces units and, ... by elements of the 4th Division under Mahert's de facto command, end quote. Which takes me to our last question. You cannot give the same answer to this question that you gave to the previous question.
So the macaroni collage is out then.
Yes. What's your favorite data visualization?
So I've gone old school for this one, and gone an old intelligence classic, which courtesy of the CIA. So this is... it comes from Richard J. Hoyer's collected work on psychology and intelligence analysis. I think I get the title right there. Poor Richards unfortunately passed away last year, but was an absolute centerpiece of the CIA's work on intelligence psychology. I think the study he's referring to here in this particular graphic is actually related to Sherman Kent's original work on psychology, and it's a sort of series of charts, scatter chart in a series of activities. He asked 23 NATO intelligence officers to put a percentage probability score next to various qualifying words in intelligence documentation. These are commonly used words used in multiple different contexts in NATO documentation. They're supposed to indicate the same thing, but if you look at the documentation, the replies here, you discover that there are some very, very disparate
they're
understandings.
Describing the same event?
Not necessarily, but they're supposed to indicate the same. These wordings are supposed to be indicative of the same kind of probability score.
Okay.
If you use the term probable, you're supposed to be talking about a specific chance of something occurring, or to give the idea. Intelligence is important. You can convey, not just understand what's going on, but also to convey to other people, like probability about.
So if somebody says the chances are slight, what this data visualization suggests is that most people consider that between 0 and 10% probability.
Correct, and you can see there's a nice cluster of people there, so that's got a fairly tight understanding of what's going on. Mm-hmm. If you look at things like probably or we believe, and you see that some people think there's less than 20% chance at one end, and some people think there's more than 80% chance of that happening. And this is this is back in the 1950s, 60s, but you understand this is not great, and you get a sense of, is probable more probable than probably? is likely is there a higher chance something that's likely to happening than something that's probable to happen? And this human element in intelligence, that how we make judgments and we convey our level of certainty in those judgments to other people is essential to good intelligence work. But it was something that, for most of human history, we really hadn't thought about, or how. So, what do these terms mean? They're vague judgment terms.
So, what this does for me is validate Henry Kissinger's rule when he was National Security Advisor, that when given, papers explaining something that might happen, he required the NSC staff to assign a probability, a numerical probability. And looking at how sloppy the use of this language is and how wide the scatter plots are for interpretation of the terms, it really does suggest that, giving something a 50% probability solves a lot of the sloppiness of the language. I really like the way it reinforces your point about human cognition and the human element in warfare, as well as in intelligence analysis. That's most excellent. Anything else? I see another perception of probability chart, Henry.
Well, I have 3 versions of this chart with increasingly nice graphics. The original one is obviously sort of, our graphical expectations in 1969, 70s were probably not as high as the full colour world, technicolor world we live in now. So I was actually interested not just in the original charts visualization, but in people's attempts to update it and make it, whether or not the introduction of additional kind of colourful graphic elements helps or hinders the message of the graphic. That's one of the things I was thinking about in terms of data visualization, is sometimes we get confused between what looks good, that we like the way it looks, and what clearly and convincingly tells the story and conveys the information to the viewer. And a good data visualization is one that does the latter, not necessarily one that does the former.
Yes, and yet a lot of data visualizations mistake visual interest from accurate depiction of meaning. So I like that you tease that out. Henry Boyd, thank you very much for this education. Thank you for the excellent work you do for the IISS. Thank you for the wry, salacious humor you bring to the doing of that work and to your leadership of people in this organization.
Thank you very much.
What I have learned today, my friends, is that Henry is even nerdier than I am, because he dove down the rabbit hole with this whole spate of perceptions of probability. I learned that how much it matters to not just weigh what we know how to measure, but to also grapple with the important human elements and the sloppiness of human cognition, so that we don't persuade ourselves that we know with greater precision than we actually do what it is we are looking at. Henry Boyd, thank you so much for this education.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me here.